Think very carefully, and with as much detail as possible. Tell us what happened in that half hour.
At around the 30-minute mark of Knives Out, Detective Benoit Blanc flips a coin. It's also the moment the story flips genres. Let's take a step back for a second. The first act of the story makes us believe that we're about to watch a traditional Agatha Christie-style murder mystery. We have a confined setting, a large cast of colorful characters as suspects, and an ingenious sleuth here to solve the mystery. Visually, the house looks like the mansion from Clue, a movie that satirizes the tropes of the genre. And like Clue, the movie is signaling to us that it's going to take these familiar genre elements and make them as big and splashy as possible. We think we have a good handle on the kinds of twists the story will take, but then writer-director Rian Johnson throws a curveball that we're not expecting. He convinces us that we already know the answer to who killed Harlan Thrombey. An extended flashback tells us that it was his nurse with the morphine in the attic, but by accident. It's at this point that the movie ceases to be an Agatha Christie detective story and instead follows the story structure of a different genre, crime stories. Now, I know those sort of sound like the same genre, and yes, detective stories are a subgenre of crime stories, but even though they have the same subject matter, we're going to think of them as different genres in this video because they differ on 2 points. They have different protagonists, and as a result, they have different story structures. In detective stories, the detective is obviously the protagonist, and we see the events from their perspective. There are 5 major beats that these stories hit. In Act 1, we meet all of the characters in a single location and learn a little about their backstories. Then at the break into Act 2, or sometimes at the midpoint, a murder is committed. Act 2 follows the detective as he investigates the crime until, at the break into Act 3, he has an epiphany and realizes who the culprit is. Then, for the entirety of Act 3, he explains in detail how the crime was committed and who is responsible. This formula has been done so many times and audiences have become so familiar with it that the murder mystery detective genre is anything but mysterious. A crime story, on the other hand, is different because it is not a mystery. In one of his lectures, John Truby, the writer of The Anatomy of Story, makes the distinction between the two genres as such. Crime is a broad category of stories that puts less emphasis on detection and more emphasis on the battle between the criminal and the lawman. In the crime genre, we follow both characters. It isn't a mystery to the audience who committed the crime, even though it is sometimes a mystery for the detective. Crime stories have a much more fluid structure than detective stories, but we can still identify some similarities. For instance, in a lot of crime stories, we're introduced to a character who is innocent at the beginning. Then, at the break into Act 2, they commit a crime which makes them extremely wealthy or powerful, as Truby puts it. Throughout Act 2, the detective tries to catch the criminal and the criminal tries to escape. Until, at the break into Act 3, the criminal makes a critical mistake, and for the rest of Act 3, things continue to fall apart for the criminal. At the end, the criminal gets away with it, is arrested, or dies. Okay, so now that we've got our building blocks for each genre, let's take a look at how Knives Out weaves them together. Right off the bat, we start with the death of Harlan, so we take a moment that is usually saved for the break into Act 2 and move it to the start. Then for the duration of Act 1, we do what usually takes 2 acts for a detective story to accomplish. The authorities interrogate the various suspects, but then Johnson uses those interrogations as a reason to motivate flashbacks to the character introductions, which was the party that happened the night before the murder. The party could have been Act 1 of this movie, but by putting it in the past, Johnson gets us through all of this in 30 minutes. Marta's flashback is the whole first act of a crime movie. She starts out innocent, accidentally commits a crime, and then takes steps to hide it. Act 2 of Knives Out matches up perfectly with Act 2 of a crime movie. We cut back and forth between Marta and Blanc as she tries to conceal the crime. Act 2 ends with the way a crime movie ends, with Blanc catching Marta. But then the movie pivots into the ending of a detective story. Blanc has his epiphany when he realizes that Marta is innocent and then delivers a classic Sherlock-esque explanation of the crime. This exact same story could have been told entirely as a straight detective story from Blanc's perspective, but I think that would have been a weaker film for a bunch of reasons. Firstly, by convincing us we know the crime, a large portion of the audience stops trying to guess who the culprit is, and instead settles in and just enjoys the movie. Secondly, it freshens up the stale story structure of a detective film and makes the movie extremely rewatchable. Not to generalize too much, but I'm usually not too interested in watching detective stories more than twice, maybe. but Knives Out is just so consistently fun that I could watch it 100 times. Mysteries can only be solved once, but Knives Out offers more than just a puzzle. And that's because, thirdly, having two perspective characters in a detective movie just opens up so much opportunity for comedy. We're led to believe Benoit Blanc is a brilliant detective, but getting to see things from Marta's perspective while he's investigating the crime just constantly undermines the idea that he's some great genius. And it does all that by breaking one of the core rules of the crime genre. As Truby states, in crime stories, you want to make both guys great, both guys equal. You want to think of a good crime story as a heavyweight fight. We want the best cop and we want the best criminal, which is why they must be equal. If one is much better than the other, fight's over in the second round. We've got to have two equal titans so that we can have a 12-round bloodbath. In Knives Out, Marta and Blanc are equally matched in that they are equally fallible. Marta is not a criminal mastermind, and Benoit Blanc is not Hercule Poirot. It's like watching a heavyweight fight where both boxers are missing every punch.
God, you're not much of a detective, are you?
Well, to be fair, you make a pretty lousy murderer.
I've seen movies use the aesthetics of one genre while following the story structure of another. I've seen movies start with the tone of one genre and then switch into the tone of another. Knives Out is the only movie I can think of that starts following the story structure of one genre, pivots into another, and then back. In my next video, I'm going to take a look at some of the movies that inspired Knives Out, which includes some Agatha Christie classics like Murder on the Orient Express and Death on the Nile. If you want to check out the original stories, then you can pick up Poirot's Finest Cases, which includes both of them and a bunch of other murder mysteries, for free with a 30-day trial on Audible, the sponsor of this video. But since Knives Out is very much about class conflict, I also want to recommend an audiobook on the subject that I really enjoyed recently. In Winners Take All, Anand Giridharadas takes a look at what he calls the elite charade of changing the world. It's a really eye-opening account of how there is often something quite insidious behind billionaires presenting themselves as the solutions to society's problems. It's a great read and very of the moment. If you want to give it a listen, then go to audible.com/justright or text JUSTRIGHT to 500-500. With a 30-day trial, you can choose one audiobook and 2 Audible originals for free. Thanks for watching, everyone, and a big thank you to my patrons for supporting me on Patreon. Keep writing, everyone.